Hi, I'm Dr. Kevin Peter Hickerson, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
All right. Yeah, we're doing this. We do these. I've got an airplane flying overhead right now, of course, right when we start the show. But Matt and I do these shows that are sort of like Matt kind of themes them up, whether it's comedy or super interesting sciencey people like yourself or a combination. I
That's
love
my
to do this.
favorite.
And we do this in part because we're trying to, if there wasn't a global pandemic, we would already have Bastards Canteen open down in Temecula, and we would be doing events, live events, and trying to promote and raise attention and money for Save the Brave. So we sort of use this vehicle as kind of a soft launch pad as we try to figure out how to go out and do live events and support. Comedy is one thing, but I just think someone like you talking for an hour, 90 minutes, whatever it is, about whatever it is that you do is already fascinating. So that's sort of what we're doing here. And this is mostly for the audience. And I thought,
my wife doesn't agree with you, but
well, she gets the full dose every day. She
yeah,
gets like
that's true. It goes on a lot longer than 90 minutes. So.
Yeah, the extended cut. But Matt, tell us why we have Kevin on.
All right. Kevin is not only handsome, he's a fantastic comedian, but also a Caltech educated nuclear physicist. And so I figure normally I get my science advice from Facebook and scrolling on my phone. So this might be a slight upgrade. So we're going to talk about some different topics: nuclear energy, coronavirus, open mics, the usual fare for these type of shows. But one thing that's always kind of been curious to me, Kevin, is nuclear energy. I've heard from some people, yes, it's the best way. It's the safest way to actually provide energy on scale. Others say, no, I've seen Chernobyl and it's evil. So if you don't mind, can you kind of give us a little bit of maybe how you got into it, and then in quick form, like the pros and cons?
Yeah, so my background, I actually, when I was young and idealistic, I worked very much on, I used my physics skills to work on renewable energy, mainly solar power, solar concentrators. And some of those projects have gone forward. So for example, one of the companies I worked on, we put all the solar panels on top of Google's Googleplex building, for example. And we bid on projects that we lost most of the bids, but other people won some of the bids to put. There's a solar concentrator out in the desert called Ivanpah. So if you ever drive from I think Vegas to LA, you pass it, and it provides a lot of the power to Vegas. And it's really hard to miss because they're very bright towers. So I worked on that for a long time, and I really did think like solar power really was like the future, because you look at it and you see there's just tons of sunlight, hitting the earth. It just seems hard to believe that that couldn't be the best way to power everything. But it really turns out the more I worked on it, the more I learned about nuclear power, the more it became really clear that the problem with solar and wind and other renewables like that is really has to do with density. It just has to do with the density of energy. And, a lot of people think of nuclear as scary because of atomic bombs, which, you should be scared of atomic bombs because they are scary. But nuclear power and nuclear bombs are very different, and a lot of people don't realize that. But they do demonstrate what makes nuclear power so good as a power source, is that the same thing that allows an atomic bomb to go off is the density. It's the fact that it's a huge amount of energy in one spot. So trying to power a city with solar is analogous to trying to blow up a city with mirrors. It would be very difficult. You can imagine. I think Archimedes tried this in the Greek times, and that was the last time anyone tried to use solar power in warfare. So it's really the same thing. If you consider this like a battle for getting the best energy out of the earth and the world, really that source of energy is uranium and fission, because you can get a huge amount of energy in an incredibly tiny space. And the reason that matters is because then you don't have to build an enormous amount of structure to collect that energy and transport that energy and move it around to different places. You can power multiple cities from one spot and just run one set of power lines to each location. And one of the things we're seeing with renewables in California, a lot of the optimism that I kind of regret I was part of, is that we're seeing a lot of power outages because it's unreliable. There's no really good storage mechanism to store it. And also it increases the number of locations that have to provide power. So that means you have to have more power lines. And we've noticed that there have been fires related to power lines. So it's ironic that we're blaming wildfires on global warming, but we're also creating the conditions that then cause these wildfires in an attempt to very slowly and inefficiently fight global warming.
These
and
systems.
if you really want to reduce greenhouse
Let me
gas.
jump in. I want to back up because these systems are so complicated, right? Like people talk about, and I'm going to use Matt's obvious open about Facebook. People talk about how they believe in science, but they don't know that there's, or even care that there's 4 laws of thermodynamics. Probably some other kind of 5th one will come up sometime as we study more about this stuff. But yeah, you're right. Like we've talked about this in the past. If you want to have electricity in all of these places, that means someone has to be paid to drive up and down the power lines and weed abate and inspect. And it's just hyper expensive. That guy consumes a lot of carbon. By the way, that one guy can't be going up in a man bucket all by himself, because if he gets hurt, there's no one there to help them. And by the way, they're driving a vehicle that could itself and has start a fire because they're driving in these remote. All of these things.
And all those things add up, and they're all related to density. It always comes down to density. And you mentioned a really interesting one, which is that the people tending to this stuff have to use carbon to do it. That's true when you set up a solar field. I learned that pretty early on. That became really frustrating. We started calculating the carbon footprint of the solar panels we were trying to install and the solar plants we were trying to make. And it became really obvious that you really hit this 1-to-1 barrier where it's just like, you pretty much the lifetime of the panel ends up producing the same amount of carbon you're supposedly stopping. And the one power source that just does not have that problem, well, there's 2. There's hydroelectric, but the other one that just does not have this problem is nuclear. The carbon footprint of nuclear is much lower than the other forms of energy. And you'll sometimes see people say that's not true, but they're not calculating it right. If you calculate it right, it comes out that way. But
there's a problem with hydroelectric too,
related with bigger plants. The more power plants you have, the more accidents you're going to have. But you don't see them on the news because they're not scary. When Ivanpah sets a bird on fire, that doesn't make it news. But you go to HBO and they have a bird, supposedly dying from radiation, and that scares the crap out of everybody for like 40 years. But birds literally do catch on fire at Ivanpah. This is not like fake. And same with turbines. I mean, they do damage, it's just that it's spread out, so it doesn't seem as terrifying as when you have a single accident at a single plant, which has only happened twice. So
I want to say this too: hydroelectric and water storage. These are things that we have to deal with. And again, if we believe in science, we're learning that because we're storing water beyond what like nature would provide, it's off-gassing methane because there's more, there are more things creating gas in the water from all.
I hadn't heard of that actually. That's interesting.
Yeah. So it's like, we're gonna have kelp ladders. And they're like, stop! But the kelp ladders, it's like because methane's a harder gas to get rid of, and so
and certainly you do damage to the environment when you build a giant dam. I mean, there's no doubt about that. It's a clean way of collecting energy, but it's not environmentally neutral. Whereas, I mean, one of my favorite things to point out is that the Ivanpah plant in California, it's the size of the Fukushima exclusion zone, and it produces 1/10 of the power that the original Fukushima plant produced. And in fact, the size of the plant, Fukushima plant, is roughly the size of the main building center at the center of Ivanpah. So people really don't understand how dramatic these scales are in difference. And it's like we used a huge amount of desert land, and I know it looks like who cares, it's desert or whatever, but that land is basically now taken up and doing very, very little, compared to what you could have done in a thing you'd barely be able to see from the road if there was a nuclear power plant in that exact same area. And, so anyway.
Kevin, are you familiar with the San Onofre plant?
Yes. Yeah. That used to be one of my favorite beaches to go to.
Is it not anymore? Has it saddened you from paddling out there?
Has it what?
Is it still one of your favorite beaches?
Well, I haven't gone there recently, but
Because I know it's been around, gosh, what, 30 plus years at least.
Uh-huh.
And I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like it's at the end of its life.
it's done.
Like,
Yeah.
oh, is it officially done? Okay. Can you
It's
give
even
us
worse. They're forcing them to pay a lot of money to sort of retrofit it, really for no reason, even though it's closed. So they're making them pay the government of California and neighbors, I guess, in the area. They're very, very concerned about the remaining spent fuel rods there. So they're making them spend a lot of money to secure them in a way that's not standard for most nuclear power plants. And this is really frustrating because spent nuclear fuel, which is unfortunately sometimes called nuclear waste, and I can explain why it's not actually waste, but spent nuclear fuel has never hurt or killed any human or animal in history, not once.
Wow.
It is one of the safest things that we have, and yet I would say it probably has one of the highest irrational fears to reality ratios of anything. A lot of that is because we saw it in The Simpsons, the dancing green rod that he sort of like loses at the market, that really sticks in people's minds. But the reality is they're put into things called dry casts, which are giant steel reinforced concrete tubes. They sit outside in the parking lot of the facility. They don't even need to be buried. We used to think they did, because we heard stories about how they had to be stayed away for hundreds of thousands of years.
From The Simpsons, the stories?
Taking into account is that fuel is actually going to be, that spent fuel rod is actually going to be the fuel of future reactors. It's just not cost effective to do that right now. It's not that we don't know how to do it. It's just that it's not worth it because nuclear energy is so cheap already. We don't need that as the fuel. But that is all usable material that can be used in future reactors. And there's more and more design. This is called advanced nuclear, which is sort of Gen 3 reactors, Gen 4 reactors. And there's lots of them that have been built as test reactors, but this is going to be powering us well into, so instead of it being waste that we're leaving for our children, it's typically, it's typically billed as we're leaving this like poisonous land for our children. The reality is we're actually leaving them more and more free energy for the future. And
you're welcome.
It will become so cheap to use that fuel that will also become the fuel of the future. A lot of people just don't realize that stuff is actually valuable. It's not it's pretty much the opposite of waste. It's just inconvenient at the moment, and it's just cheaper to leave it in the parking lot than to try and power it. It's cheaper to go buy new uranium and run a plant on that than it is to use that, just because of the way we've been doing it already. But that changes every year. We learn more and more about how to recycle that stuff.
It sounds like nuclear energy needs a better publicist. Will you volunteer for the job?
I think there's been a lot of progress. Like one of the things I'm really encouraged about is this is the first time in 50 years that both major parties have endorsed nuclear. So this was really frustrating because for a while the Democratic Party was the party of anti-fossil fuels and pro anti-global warming, and I would say global warming alarmism, but I don't want to get too hot on that. But then on the other hand, the Republican Party was typically willing to accept nuclear, less scared of it, but they were also still just very pro fossil fuels. And now I think we're actually seeing a convergence where both parties are actually saying, look, we actually have a common solution that we both like, which is, it's like it was kind of like the VP debates. It's like, whoa, why aren't they talking over each other? What's going on? I don't.
I mean, we can agree on something of different sides.
So
that's
weird.
Strange.
Yeah.
How would you remedy San Onofre? I mean, if it was only up to you, Kevin, what would you want to see done with it?
Oh, I would reopen it. I would spend the money that's being spent, or I would say wasted, on the storage project that's going on, and I would retrofit it to use the same facility to upgrade it to a working new reactor type, like a mixed fuel reactor or something like that. The facility is perfectly good. The containment vessel is perfectly good. The cooling system is really nice because it dumps the energy out into the ocean. It does have a little bit of impact on the fish in the area, in that the water is warmer there than around the cooling pipes than it is. But that really just has the effect of bringing fish that would be maybe a few miles, maybe 100 miles to the south to that area,
It's
just
El
from
Nino.
Mexico up a little bit. So I don't think that's a huge impact. Just makes us a little bit more like Hawaii. But in terms of the ocean, it's a really small amount of energy. And again, it's only noticeable because of the density. It's this power plants have the capacity of, I think both of them, if they could have both been retrofitted, it could have been up to 4 gigawatts, which is just, that's like, I think that's about a tenth of California's power. Right now, the big fight is over the Diablo Canyon power plant, which provides a quarter of California's electricity and half of all carbon-free electricity in California. So if we shut it down, we would be just literally throwing away half our carbon-free energy. And yet there's environmentalists doing this, the same ones who sometimes are fighting so viciously against global warming. It really makes very little sense to combine those two ideas. But luckily, a lot of environmentalists are realizing this, and they're joining the battle for this like actual workable solution. I don't personally think global warming is the end of the world, as a lot of people. A lot of scientists disagree with me, but
And my Facebook feed, please.
yeah, but yes. Yeah, obviously I've been accused of being literally Hitler for questioning that we're not going to die in 10 years.
Wait,
but
I thought you were Hitler.
I thought, yeah.
I was going to put that in your remarks.
But
I
don't think scaring children is really the way to do it. But to the degree that it is a problem, nuclear energy is the way to solve it. So that's why, that's what frustrates me about it.
One of these things that I've been mocking and said I'm going to continue to do it. People that believe in science seem to not know that science often disagrees with itself, because we can have this.
The of my life, yes.
What? Science isn't just one thing?
No, it's not God.
Yeah,
everybody mocks the magic man in the sky, but they want to have another God, the universe. But that's not God. It's the universe. That's what we pray to. Or we pray to science.
Science, and I have spoken. Like it's on tablet.
So
it's
there's
absolutely the exact opposite of that.
Right.
Especially the most controversial issues. Almost always there's not an agreement among scientists, and that's why it's controversial. It's true that politics argues over things that scientists find frustrating sometimes, because usually scientists come to a consensus faster than the public if it's in their area of expertise. But there's also usually always a good reason why there's a political debate over something. There usually is a really good reason. Sometimes it's because the science conflicts with human rights or with freedom or something like that, and so it gets a little bit more complicated. But other times there's just subtleties to it. So with the shutdown, the mask debate has been just absolutely insane. And this one was particularly frustrating because my wife and I worked on masks at the beginning of the pandemic because she's a medical device professor. And we were asked by hospitals there was a huge mask shortage. We were asked to make them. And so we started doing tons of research on how masks work, how to make them cheaply at home. And when I say masks, I'm not talking about the cloth stuff. I'm talking about HEPA grade, better than N95 masks for doctors in emergency rooms to use. This is what we were trying to produce for these hospitals. And it was just insane how that got politicized. It was so weird. And it was the same where people are like, but science says that a mask saves us all. It's just, it's like, okay, but I am a scientist and I don't agree with you. So, but that doesn't matter on Facebook. That's just not how Facebook works.
Kevin,
it's not the mask that we're even worried about. I saw Joe Biden talking from a distance, an enormous distance. And he's like talking, and he has to project, and so the mask is hopping all over his face. At one point, he grabs it and he wriggles it around. like, what are we doing? Like, that's not science. You can't be fucking with the goddamn mask,
Yeah, yeah. Our own health director, who interestingly goes by Dr. Barbara Ferrer on the news all the time. I gotta make this really clear. I go by Dr. Kevin Peter Hickerson, but never when I'm giving medical advice. I just want to make that really clear. My doctor calls me Kevin, and he does not call me Dr. Hickerson. I'd like him to, but he doesn't. But Dr. Ferrer is not a scientist or a medical doctor, and I respect her education, but her education was in public welfare, not in medical research. And yet she just, at the beginning of the LA pandemic, she just came out every day, basically making it sound like she was giving medical advice to everybody, and it just drove me insane. Anyway.
So Kevin,
I want to add more to this science conflict thing because, good or bad, the president has said we're not going to be in the Middle East and we're going to stabilize that region and try to get the hell out of the way. To accomplish that, we have to become energy independent, and now we're pushing oil out. We're an exporter rather than an importer. Yeah. This is part of the political science thing. We're like, if we want to calm that region, we probably should handle it differently than we have.
This is a great example with fracking. Is a great example. America seems to be really good at picking these like no-win scenarios. I don't know why, but somehow our two-party system is just fantastic. It's like, I don't know if you know about game theory, but there's a game called Prisoner's Dilemma where basically both sides win by screwing each other over. Right. And then the end result is nobody wins.
Right.
Both lose worse than they could. That seems like America's system. So for a while there was just a huge anti-fracking movement, and I understand again fracking is scary and stuff, but it really was at the cost of not importing oil. It wasn't at the cost of not using oil. Anyone can choose to not use oil. You can choose to not drive as much if you want. As an individual, you could choose to do that. But if you want to get your oil from somewhere other than the Middle East, you got to frack it. And so, it was very frustrating to see, well, we got to stop having all these endless wars. But then also, I don't want to be energy independent. Those two don't go together.
Or how about fix my road? You're like, hey, that asphalt, by the way,
it's from oil.
Kevin, I want to rewind a little bit on the masks issue you were working on. Uh-huh. In layman's terms, from what you learned, what's the good and bad of it? Like, obviously they seem to help, what advice can you give?
All right, so what we learned is, first of all, masks, a lot of people think of masks as a filter, as like a thing that you blow air through and then the coronavirus gets caught because it's so small. That couldn't be further from the truth. The coronavirus is incredibly tiny. I mean, it's really tiny. It's 120 nanometers across. Wow. And when it becomes something called an aerosol, which is something that a lot of scientists knew it was from the very beginning because of there's certain events called super spreader events that occurred all the way back in China and even occurred with SARS-1. Mm-hmm. So this was not a huge surprise to a lot of scientists. But the coronavirus it has the ability to form an aerosol. An aerosol is very different than a droplet. And this confuses the public a lot because the real issue is that light does not scatter off of an aerosol. Only ultraviolet light scatters off an aerosol. So you cannot see the coronavirus when it is in its smallest form. So you can shine a laser at it. You've probably seen these YouTube videos where people shine a green laser proving that the droplets, their masks work and stuff like that. The problem with that is green laser light does not scatter off of things that small. It's simply too long a wavelength of light. Huh. So it does something called Rayleigh scattering, but it's highly suppressed for that size. So it scatters off the droplets. So a lot of people, including medical doctors, don't understand the physics of these droplets spreading because they don't have the tools to do it. This is actually, oddly enough, this is in the realm of particle physics, which is, kind of a weird thing to say because it seems medical, but I mean, it's medical when it's in the body, but it's not medical the second it leaves the body. It's just a particle floating through the air. And the thing about aerosols is they behave like air. They don't behave like particles. They float in the air, and they float in it in a way that's more like a fly trapped in honey, not like a little dust thing that you would normally see, because that's the stuff we see with our eyes. Mm-hmm. But they float at a much smaller molecular scale where they're really more like a fly trapped in honey. And the way masks typically tend to block these particles is they have little nanofibers on them that have electrostatic charge, and they stick to those particles. But the problem is those particles have to be specially made, and they're only made in N95 masks. And they also only last for a few times that you wear it. They stop working after a few times because once you start breathing water on it, the charge goes away. And it's very hard to get that charge back. And when you had people working, when you're sanding something and you put an N95 mask, you used to be able to buy masks to do home improvement. Remember those? I haven't seen one in my hardware store in like years. But you used to be able to buy those. The way it kept the dust out of your lungs is that it would stick to the mask, and then you'd throw it away and get a new one. It wasn't a big deal because we weren't asking 7 billion people to wear a brand new one every day for the rest of their lives, like we are right now. Yeah. So they do work in a clinical setting where somebody's doing it right. So not doing a Joe Biden, like you said, touching their face. You can't do that. It has to be one you're willing to throw out. Although I have friends who are doctors who've said they've been asked to use, at the beginning of the pandemic, they were being asked to reuse their mask for as much as a month. And they were calling me up frantically because they knew I was working. It was like, is this going to work? And I'm like, probably not. Good luck. But when you're outside jogging, that, it really doesn't do anything. And then because you're not really exposed to the to coronavirus when you're outside. I mean, it blows around. And then the other one that's frustrating is it also doesn't work on the other extreme end, which is where you're trapped in a room for hours. So when an employee, for example, is in a room, it doesn't matter how long they're wearing a mask. It eventually gets out because it comes out the sides. It comes, it's air. So it doesn't just stay trapped on that mask forever. And so eventually that room gets filled with this aerosol. And that's where you see these events where like 100 people get sick at a coffee shop, or the famous event in a church where people were singing, because somebody who was there for hours, probably I don't know if we ever tracked down who, but probably somebody like maybe the person running the choir or something, was exhaling. And so the whole room was contaminated. So the secret there isn't to wear masks, it's to ventilate the room or go outside or something like that. Change the air, or HEPA filter the air.
When we had everything closed down, when they closed our pool down, and I swim laps down in Irvine, and it's a big, huge facility. You don't want it to be too crowded. I get that. But there's a doctor, and now that I know that not every doctor is an actual doctor, and she was like, yeah, you can't swim in a pool during COVID because of, you ready for it? Fecal shedding. That was the big problem. Fecal shedding, not like that's why we were closing the pool. Like, are you new?
About that. I warned people that. Well, see, that part of the problem I have being a comedian and a scientist is that nobody can tell when I'm serious and when I'm joking. When I post stuff on Facebook, which I kind of like, because then if I make a mistake, I'm like,
that was I was joking.
Yeah.
Sorry, you don't have a sense of humor.
Right.
No, but one of the jokes I made is we knew also from SARS-1 that fecal aerosols were one of the forms. So literally farts is known to be able to spread SARS. And only recently did they find out that actually is true of this current COVID. There is a paper that just came out that finally said, yes, people got COVID from farts. And the joke I had was like, are we going to have like butt plug mandates? Mandates? Is that what's
put a mask down below?
I've been safe all these years and I didn't even know it. So it's bonus.
I mean, what I love about it is because everybody says mask isn't giving up your freedom. Like, well, butt plug might be. That way. What is the limit exactly? Like when are you giving up your freedom? What orifice do you have to cover before you think?
How many?
So if we wash our hands and we go to a buffet, we could bring buffets back. We just can't serve legumes and shit. We got to just like keep the fibrous things down to a minimum.
Yeah, no beans.
No beans. This is a no bean buffet, COVID friendly.
So Kevin, can you tell us how you got into comedy and what created the urge?
Well, I'm really eager for attention.
I mean, you're doing the show, so yeah.
Comedians are. That's pretty common. it's just general insecurity and crippling depression combined to just constantly seek out approval of hundreds of people at once. Completely healthy.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And at the same time, I got to do public speaking as a scientist, but you can only do that so often. And I found out that people don't really like it if you make jokes when you're talking about science, especially over in Europe. In German and Italian audiences, they get very angry if you make a joke. Like, there's no time for this.
Yeah, name a famous German comedian. Nothing comes to mind.
Yeah, fishing is not funny. All right. That's the worst German accent ever, by the way. Okay, so I started going to I always loved going to stand-up comedy, and then one time I just as a joke posted that I opened for Dane Cook on Facebook, and I got this amazing reaction where everyone was like, "I didn't even know you did stand-up comedy." And then I decided, oh shit, now I need to become a stand-up comedian and open for Dane Cook so that I don't look like a lying jerk.
Yeah.
And so I started going to open mics, and then I started getting booked on shows, and then I eventually got to open for Dane Cook for real. So, and then I was like, oh, all my goals are achieved, so we can just have a permanent lockdown, and I don't need to be performing anymore. And
you posted it into existence. Congratulations.
Yeah,
and when did this start, Kevin?
Really, the reason is just the second I started doing it, I just loved it a lot. It's really fun, and I miss it so much. And I see so much pain in my comedian friends on Facebook. Just I don't think people really appreciate how hard this is for people where this is their only outlet. I'm kind of lucky in that I have science and I have a sense of purpose now because I'm actually making a lot of money off of COVID. I hate to say that, but I've been getting nonstop contracts to work on COVID killing technology, and the mask stuff we did for free. That was just to help first responders. But since then, we've been my wife and I have been doing contracts to help people sterilize COVID. I'm working with some people who are going to build UV light devices to sterilize bacteria and viruses, and they're going to actually test it on real live COVID at Boston University.
Well, that's exciting.
And by the way, if you ever have any doubt about me saying masks don't work very well, take a look at what Boston University researchers wear when they're working with COVID. I guarantee you they are not just sitting there wearing a mask. They're actually in a full-blown ET-looking spacesuit thing that looks straight out of Mars Attacks. They're in a complete isolated bubble with an air supply coming in from the outside. They don't take any chances because, they don't just go, oh, I got a mask, it's cool. Just live COVID on a petri dish, these labs take this very seriously when they're dealing with it. But for us,
I want to ask you,
a bandana up there, you're good to go.
I want to ask you about our COVID approach, because one of the political arguments, and this is in no way a political conversation, it's just I'm using this as a setting. One of the things we keep hearing is that the government's approach to COVID is the greatest blunder in presidential history. And then you also look at hey, we were ill prepared because as a nation we worry about shit after it happens. We flexed in a lot of corporate capacity, created a lot of contract capacity, and we're rocketing ahead faster than science normally ever moves at a national level. Can you give us a sense for are either of those things true? Is it something else? You've been doing it, so what do you think?
Probably gonna make a lot of enemies from this, but
make sure you're recording.
Live on the Break It Down show, Kevin fucks himself.
I think as usual, Trump didn't necessarily do a good job of communicating. But I think in terms of what actually happened, I think we did about as good as we could do. I'm pretty frustrated that China kept so much secret, although that's pretty standard for China. What I've been most disappointed actually is in American scientists, and particularly above European scientists, who have willfully participated in the politicization of it. And maybe people are going to accuse me of doing that too. I don't know. But I really feel like a lot of things, it really came to the point that if Trump said something, it immediately became not science. despite the fact that an epidemiologist could have said it the day before, and he might have just said it, and he says it in his way, and it sounds silly sometimes, when he says it. Like an example would be bleach killing coronavirus. Bleach kills coronavirus. That's not a disputed fact. And then it turns into this whole thing where everybody's joking about injecting bleach, just which never happened. He didn't, didn't say that, but that's just. I'm disappointed with my fellow scientists who participated in the taking their political bias and projecting it onto what's scientifically accurate and what's an expert. But I think we've had that problem for a while. We have this belief in, when you deify experts, the problem is, that's not really how science works. There is no expert that is the universal expert. You have people who know more about a topic than another, but if you just go out and handpick the expert that you like the most, which you can do nowadays, you can just find any YouTube video. You can find my opinion. You can find somebody else's opinion. You can find somebody who, had a vision from space aliens and calls themselves an expert. You have the whole spectrum, and all those people have their own biases. So you can pick out pretty much anything. And I think it's really frustrating that on our end, the people's end, actually, this is why I said I might make enemies. I don't think it was the government so much as that was the problem. That I think as a people, we didn't respond well to it. We divided ourselves instead of just treating it more like a thing that we all have to understand.
Well, playing Monday morning epidemiologist, Kevin, what in hindsight, what should we have done if in the world according to Kevin?
In hindsight,
yeah.
Well, this is also not a popular opinion, but I felt really, really very much from the beginning there was almost nothing we could do. So, and a lot of epidemiologists felt that way. I think trying to isolate people we identify as vulnerable was really important, but I think we should have actually spread the virus as fast as possible, not as slow. And that was an extremely unpopular opinion past April. And it still is, but that's actually how I feel about it. I think developing treatments to reduce the lethality in a hospital is extremely important. But I think in terms of trying to combat a virus is a lot, once it's really spread, once it was outside of China, it basically became impossible to contain, except on islands like New Zealand. And I think the fastest way to try and fight it would be to just achieve natural herd immunity, in which roughly 20 to 40% of the population catches it, doesn't really get sick from it, and then we can start interacting with the vulnerable who have a much higher chance of dying from it. That's a tough one though, because that's asking. Yeah. It's not a really ethical thing to ask people to do. I definitely don't believe in COVID parties or anything like that, but in terms of just living your life, I think to some degree, disease is part of life. Again, this isn't really a scientific opinion. This is more of a personal opinion. And that I feel like if you just, if you don't accept that, then you don't get to live your life. And it's going to happen again. So that's part of why I'm a little worried about this. It's not just this one time. We're going to have more diseases. There's going to be more mutations and more other viruses in the future. Whether or not this one was engineered, someone will engineer one in the future. So we have to be ready for that. There's a possibility that we'll have, biological warfare will be the norm in the future. I don't want to depress anybody, but I am a comedian.
Too late.
Yeah. Depressing. But this could be the norm, where countries just try and infect each other with viruses, aimed at each other's population. That could be like the new Cold War. I hope that doesn't happen, but we certainly have the technology for it, and it's not going to go away. And ironically, the more we study how to fight viruses, the more we learn how to make them. So that's the other thing that's scary.
That's how a Tom Clancy novel starts, is they aerosolize Ebola.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And it's fanciful in a book, and maybe Ebola is not the right vector, but all you got to do is find the right vector.
Yeah, SARS was pretty much the right vector. Yeah, the movie Contagion. The movie Contagion says a bat coronavirus. I don't know if you guys have watched that one, but it
a
got
while
the nail.
ago.
So this wasn't a complete. It shouldn't have been a surprise from that point of view. It was just a matter of if and when. But we also can't lose track of other threats. I mean, one of the ones I'm really interested in is asteroids. I know they sound like, again, a science fiction one. It's science fiction until the day it happens. Like there's going to be a time when in our future where we're going to have, as a planet, we're going to have to band together to stop an asteroid from hitting a major city or worse. So
I would even say we've gotten off a little easy with this pandemic because of our ability to develop all these different people, whether they're scientists or whatever. We've gotten off when you look at our overall mortality rate in the U.S., like we've actually done really. I know the number 200,000 scares everybody, and of course it's a tragedy, but that many people already die at this point in a year, no matter what.
I think it could have been worse. I think it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah.
At the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't really know the mortality rate. And there were numbers all over the place for a variety of reasons. For example, South Korea saw an anomalously low mortality rate, and then Italy saw an anomalously high mortality rate. So back then, I did a simple calculation. I was like, look, we could lose 250 million people on the planet. I just posted that. It's like, I don't want to depress anyone, but that is the possibility. And I think actually that number was way too high. I said that was the upper limit, so I wasn't claiming to predict the future, but then now that upper limit's way lower. So we've made progress there. What's funny is there's another similarity between epidemiology and nuclear physics, which is that epidemics behave a lot like the core of a reactor, because the virus acts like neutrons, and the uranium molecules act like vectors, like people, and basically they have an R number just like viruses do. So one fission molecule goes off and gives 2 neutrons, which then goes and infects 2 other uranium atoms and infects 2 others. And you get this chain reaction, and that's part of what makes nuclear fission give off so much energy so quickly, is that it's a chain reaction. So it's sort of like you infect the fuel rod with this reaction, this chain reaction. So what's funny about this is the mathematics of it behaves exactly the same. So like social distancing is a lot like the control rods in a nuclear reactor. You stick it in and you separate distance between people and you slow down the reaction, but you really can't ever quite make it go away completely. So that's the hard part until we reach herd immunity either naturally or with a vaccine, if we ever get one.
Yeah. What about some of the things that have kind of gotten buried in the news as we've come along? There's some pretty remarkable things in 2020. How about these new like mini reactors that are coming out that they're like, we think these things are going to work? Can you talk a little bit about that and what the fuck am I even talking about?
Yeah, I love these because unfortunately they're still expensive, but they can do so many cool things. Like they can just be shipped anywhere, and they can be put sort of in the middle of nowhere where people are less scared of them. Like for example, I mentioned putting one where Ivanpah was. Nobody lives there, so if there was an accident, nothing would change about that at all. I mean, if anything, it might make it a nice reserve for wild animals, or something. Might actually be an environmental paradise. But so these mini reactors are nice. The problem they have is scale, because they don't produce electricity well. But there's a lot of other cool things you can do with them. You can make hydrogen with them, and you can also make fuels with them. And so I'm very excited about trying to look into using those to make fuels for airlines and for cars and
could those be privately owned? Like I've never. It sounds fascinating.
They're cheaper. The upfront capital cost is so much lower that it doesn't have to be a government that does it. A company can buy one because they can cost closer to 100 million rather than like 5 billion. By the way, a lot of people point out that they try and say nuclear is too expensive because it costs billions of dollars per reactor. But you got to remember, it's so important. It's dollars per watt that actually matters in the end. It's how many dollars. So if you spend $1 billion on a reactor that creates 1 billion watts, you still have $1 per watt, which is still cheaper than pretty much every other kind of fuel. So that's really the key that has to be taken away. But it's hard for somebody other than a government to just have $1 billion in cash and be like, oh, here you go, one of these.
But like if Jeff Bezos, for example, could someone, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and also smaller countries too right now. A lot of countries want, especially islands is a great example. Islands want nuclear power because they're actually the most worried about global warming because of sea level rise. It actually ends up impacting them more than pretty much everybody else on Earth. So a lot of islands, surprisingly, are very pro-nuclear, but they don't have the population or the scale to justify building a full-size one. So the sooner we can get them like little mini reactors on their islands, the better, because then they can have nice clean air. Nobody wants like pollution around a tropical island. The whole point is to relax. And Jamaica is an example. They're very pro-nuclear. Actually, they were the first island nations to get a nuclear license from the IAEA, and they're really, because they spend 40 cents per kilowatt hour, which adjusted for our GDP, that's like thousands of dollars on electricity per month equivalent. So it really is holding back their country that they have to spend so much. That's because they just don't have any natural sources of energy. So they have to import it all, and they're kind of screwed.
So what are some of Kevin,
go ahead.
Obviously there's a lot of pushback against nuclear energy. What are the risks that you think are valid, and is there any workable solution where we can use this where most people will be happy with it?
Yeah. Okay. So I think the risk to large cities is a legitimate concern, because whether it actually poses much danger to life, I think is kind of, I think the danger to life is actually pretty small. So for example, in Fukushima, no one died of radiation sickness, not a single person. But people did die from the evacuation, especially elderly people who really weren't able to move. And they died as a result of the stress of moving. And then on top of that, people died from depression from being moved from their area.
Yeah.
Now that happened to other places that experienced tsunami damage. So it's not just from the accident, it's partially from the tsunami. I mean, tsunamis are depressing. But I think it's a legitimate concern that taking out a whole city is it's going to cost stuff. It's going to cost, human pain, whether or not it actually kills people. The fact that if there's an accident, people will be too scared to live there can't be ignored. So I think it's totally appropriate to build nuclear power plants away from population centers. So I think in that sense, that is a legitimate concern, that we shouldn't just have a nuclear power plant in the middle of downtown Manhattan, because even a minor leak could cost, trillions of dollars in collateral damage. And, it's just, with that many people nearby, even subtle problems, there. But there's ways around that. There's lots of places where you can build nuclear power plants away from people, transport the energy through an intermediate source, and bring it to people in populated areas.
One of the things that we would definitely find, and this just is from my experience being in conflict zones, is that if you could reliably, and we have Bjorn Lomborg on the show talking about climate change, and he totally agrees, if you can reduce poverty, and I would say if you can increase the amount of available electricity, and just make them energy rich as opposed to energy poor, you're going to save a lot more lives and struggle and strife, and you fix a lot of problems. So yeah, global warming, but is there a not symbiotic, not synergistic, but is there an ideal package that you could send to a country, where it's like, this is your desalinization, nuclear powered water treatment, something complex, where it kind of all works together in some kind of systematic way, where you could create benefit by just having this thing that costs, I don't know, $1 trillion or whatever it is?
There isn't one yet, but we're so close. And what you're talking about is great, is like a hybrid system that just provides a lot of solutions for a remote area or a poorer country or a more remote country or area. And like what you said is perfect, like a combination desalination, fuel producing, and electricity producing hybrid, I think, is the future. So this is This is something I've been interested in for the last.
You gotta add water treatment there. You can't give fresh water and not get rid of bad water. You have to close the loop on that. Otherwise, everybody gets cholera and they get pissed off again.
Ah, okay, all right. Yeah,
add it
well,
to the
the nice
list,
thing
yeah.
about nuclear is it's a source of heat, and heat is very useful. It doesn't just make electricity; it does a lot of things. You can, especially now, we have a new kind of reactor called a very high temperature reactor. And what's nice about these reactors, they're a lot safer too. They're believed to be. We haven't been running them as long, but they don't use water as their coolant. They use gas as their coolant, and so they can't have these big steam explosions that you've seen with Fukushima and with Chernobyl.
Right.
But the other benefit is that heat is much hotter. That you can get much hotter heat out of it, a higher temperature heat. And with that, you can do all sorts of really cool things like sterilizing water, like producing fuels, and heating buildings, and so there's a lot of things you can do with it. There's industrial uses too. You can melt metals with it if it's hot enough.
Wow.
And so I think we're entering a new phase where we're going to see nuclear being used for all kinds of stuff, not just electricity. And I think that's when people are really going to realize how awesome it is. You also talked about a danger. One of the ones I want to address is proliferation. We've gotten much better at making sure nuclear power plants really can't be used for proliferation. They're much easier to monitor now. We have a lot of really great technology to make sure that, like what happened in North Korea, doesn't happen again. Where they managed to remove plutonium out of the core without the UN noticing. This happened in the 90s.
Right.
They basically kicked out inspectors, and then they came back a month later, and all the plutonium was gone, and nobody
Where
knew.
to go?
And it was a mystery. It took a while to figure out, but now we know how to track that. So that we can help solve that problem. Also, we can make it so that even a country maybe you're not quite sure you trust with. I totally trust Jamaica, by the way, no problem. I absolutely.
They're not mad at
They get to
anybody.
have the bomb tomorrow.
I trust them too. Yeah.
They're like, no, man, that's going to blow you up today. I have no problem with Jamaica having the bomb. But some places you might be worried that maybe a hostile group would take it over. So we've gotten way better at making reactors that can't be converted. They're not just like a proxy for a thing that makes warheads, which is one of the other things that people have been worried about in the past.
It's one of the areas where, as a world, we kind of agree that we need to work together. Like, we can't agree on energy policy, we can't agree on land policy, but we all agree, like, okay, we'll all push our sovereignty aside to make sure that we hold each other accountable. And granted, we're probably going to dog on that, but it is the one area where there's some hope of getting some true global leadership to get things done. Because we do make things messy.
And what's funny is I work at Los Alamos, and we have a lot of still Cold War battles kind of going on behind the scenes. But it's funny as as scientists, we get along really well. With China and Russia, and supposedly we work very well together to try and prevent people we all agree we don't want to have nuclear weapons. For example, like we can all agree. I think most countries in the world agree they don't want ISIS to have nuclear weapons. So it's like we don't really, there's not much disagreement about that nowadays. So we put aside our differences at least for that. So.
One of the other big things that's come out, and I hope we have time to discuss it here, but in 2020, we've also made advancements in discovering and processing time crystals and making time travel. It's still a theory and a dream, but there's actual pieces to this puzzle that we can see.
Well, I don't have a time machine yet. I wish I did. Although it'd be hard.
I ordered one.
My general relativity professor published the first serious paper on time travel. He published, this is back in the late 70s or early 80s, I don't remember, but he was a friend of Stephen Hawking, and he's the executive producer of Interstellar. He was Kip Thorne, and he wrote a paper where he basically described the first legitimate way you could build a time machine from black holes or from wormholes. And ever since he told us about that in class, I've been like obsessed with trying to build one or seeing if it's possible. The one he picked out wasn't very practical because you needed 10,000 times the mass of the sun to make it work. So, I don't have that kind of resources yet.
Right.
But
Kip has said he'd come on the show. He's just really busy trying to save the world, so I don't mess with him too much. But yeah,
he did say he told me that maybe this is because I've asked him too many times. I've had him on my podcast. I thought he said he was, ever since he got his Nobel Prize, he said he was done doing any media or something. But maybe he changed his mind.
Well, he hasn't done it. And it's been 2 years.
Okay, but it's like stand up. Maybe it's you say you're gonna quit or something, and then when you stop, you're just like
you can't. There's no quit. Well, a favor to ask, Kevin, and you've been awesome. I know you lecture and you teach, and now millions and millions of people are listening to Pete and me right now.
That's right.
So what nuggets of scientific knowledge either that we have or you want people to understand, like what, if you had to break it down to a few pieces of knowledge that you want the youth of America and beyond to know, what would that be?
I like that question. Don't listen to people who say we're all going to die at all cost. That's actually the worst way to live your life and the worst way to be a scientist. I would say focus on, if you're scared of a problem, just focus on all the different ways you can learn to fix it rather than, becoming depressed and not going to school and deciding there's nothing you can do. A friend of mine, Michael Schellenberger, just released a book, Apocalypse Never, and I recommend you guys read it.
Great title.
Because he's an environmentalist, pro-nuclear environmentalist who is against climate alarmism, and we're in a world where anytime a scientist brings up a problem, immediately gets turned into this gloom and doom event that there's nothing we can do. We should just give up and surrender our lives to somebody else who's going to solve the problem. And I think it's exactly the opposite. It should be, you should go to school and study all the amazing things that you can do and try and figure out, never mind what apocalypse to avoid, but what paradises you can make in all parts of the solar system and the world. This last decade has actually been really amazing because we've discovered more water on more celestial bodies than all of human history put together just in the last 10 years by factors of 1,000. There's 1,000 times more life-giving water in our backyard than we ever thought before. So I think the future is incredibly promising, and I feel like the real battle is the constant pressure to try and hold us all back. And I think some people are just scared of the accomplishments of one group of people comes at the cost of other people, and I think that's one of the worst ideas that's ever been invented, is this idea that we live in a zero-sum universe. Because throughout my life, even though there's been all these horrible things that have happened, the possibilities have only just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and science fiction keeps becoming reality every day of my life. And I hope kids who see what looks like science fiction to them now, they see that as like a possibility in the future, or at least the optimistic science fiction. Don't pay attention to the negative, although you still should be worried about asteroids.
Yeah.
Don't lose any sleep over it.
Yeah. It's a great point, though. I mean, if we seek to understand and then pick a portion of the problem, I learned a thing from my technology podcast. This guy was like, never bet against software engineers, because they will solve they'll just like ants. They'll pick up one part of the problem, throw it away, and it'll be gone. And
they'll also hack your bank account if you make them
hack
mad.
your bank account. They'll get rich. Yeah,
Pay them on time. Yeah.
But yeah, I appreciate it. Let's do some more of these. It's really great to have you on.
This is fun. You guys are great to talk to. I feel like I wasn't that funny, but it was maybe the pandemic makes it hard. I don't know.
Hey, you made farts a vector for COVID. That's hilarious.
We talked about nuclear energy and butt plugs, and we haven't had a guest do that in weeks. So thank you.
All right, stand by. I'm going to shut this thing down.